This isn't quite the same thing that we've been discussing in the last two lectures. Linguistic relativity asks, how do specific linguistic differences between particular languages produce specific psychological effects? Hoffman's quote touches on something much broader. It suggests that having more than one language might influence the mind beyond distinct linguistic structures. So possessing multiple languages, any languages, might do something more general to multilingual minds compared to monolingual ones. This is getting closer to what I meant by capital L effects of language. A few lectures ago, we discussed mechanisms for multilingualism, or in other words, what occurs in multilingualism. In this lecture, we'll ask a new question. What occurs as a result of multilingualism? To answer this, we first need to make a distinction between the intended function of speaking more than one language and its many unintended consequences. In strict Aristotelian terms, the functional purpose of multilingualism is clear: to increase the number of people you can effectively converse with. However, as the eminent biologist Nicholas Tinbergen points out, just because a behavior is designed for one thing doesn't mean it can't also do other things. Consider a lion chasing its prey. Even though the intended function of the chase is to eat, this activity produces many other things for the lion, like strengthening muscles, honing senses, and exercising the heart. With this in mind, we can ask, what are the potential byproducts of speaking multiple languages? This is a relatively recent scientific question. It started to become a field all its own around the turn of the millennium, and it was inspired by research that didn't necessarily have anything to do with language. Recall that the 1990s were the decade of the brain, a time when neuroscience research was reaching a wider scientific audience? One of the most exciting topics during that period was how experience and plasticity changed the human brain. We've already talked about this at length in the context of faces and the fusiform expertise area, but there are all sorts of other nice examples too. Like, becoming a virtuoso cellist expands the size of your somatosensory cortex in the playing hand. Or, novices of the video game Tetris have more neurally diffuse and disorganized visual motor networks than expert players. And the size of the posterior hippocampus, where spatial memories are encoded and retrieved, is positively correlated with years of being a London taxi driver. This neuroscience work dovetailed with another research area that has been around since the 1980s. It was known that actively learning new things, especially at younger or older ages, was good for brain health. This is sometimes called cognitive reserve. The term is taken on many different meanings, but the basic idea is that your brain is like a muscle, and like any other muscle, when it becomes exercised, it becomes stronger and more resistant to fatigue and decline. Seeing the link between these two areas, researchers in the late 1990s started to think about learning languages as a way to induce plasticity and boost cognitive reserve. This connection should make sense if you think back to our lecture on multilingual mechanisms. Recall that speaking multiple languages requires a beefed-up prefrontal cortex, or PFC, presumably to control and monitor which language is being used at what time. This executive functioning role of the PFC is a classic domain general skill. It's not specific to just language. Given that, might this consistent linguistic flexing of the PFC affect other aspects of cognition too? This was the question that made Ellen Bialystock of York University in Canada famous. In her 2001 book, Bilingualism in Development, Bialystock introduced the general public to the idea that being bilingual enhanced cognitive control in children and adults. Cognitive control is a metacognitive ability of the PFC that involves deploying attention to what is relevant while ignoring what is not. For example, when I'm trying to speak Japanese, my cognitive control system attempts to lock onto Japanese while inhibiting English as much as possible. This is a lot of work for me, but true bilinguals become pros at this skill. How would you even quantify such a thing? Bialystock cleverly used a well-known measure of cognitive control called a Stroop task. Stroop tasks require you to focus on one dimension of a stimulus while actively ignoring another dimension. For example, imagine seeing the word blue written on a computer screen. And suppose that sometimes it is written in a blue font, but other times a red font. Now suppose that your task is to identify the color of the font, red or blue, while ignoring the actual meaning of the word. On average, people are much slower at doing this when the word and font differ. You can think of this delay as an index of how hard it is to tune out irrelevant information. The slower you are, the harder it is. Bialystock did a variation of this Stroop task, and here's what she found. Compared to monolinguals, bilingual children and adults showed much smaller timing differences, suggesting that they could more easily focus on the relevant piece of information without getting distracted by the irrelevant piece. One explanation for these findings is that because bilinguals have a lifetime of experience activating and suppressing different languages and switching back and forth between them, they are constantly flexing their cognitive control muscle. This allows them to become very good at using cognitive control for all sorts of metacognitive activities, not just ones related to language. But isn't it possible that people who are already good at cognitive control are just the ones that eventually become bilingual? That's a fair question, but most people don't choose to become bilingual. They're just born into it. Not only that, the effects of being born into bilingualism seem to show up very early in life, even before babies utter their first words. For example, Bialystock and colleagues had 6-month-olds learn to look at an object that produced a reward. Then the reward shifted to a new object, and babies needed to learn to switch their old-looking behaviors to get the new reward. Some of the infants had only been exposed to one language for their first 6 months of life, and some had been exposed to a second language for that same period. The main finding was that infants who had been exposed to a second language could more easily, more successfully, and more quickly switch between their looking behavior when given this new information. This suggests that even mere exposure to a second language may contribute to enhanced cognitive control mechanisms in the developing brain. On the other end of the developmental spectrum, Bialystock and her colleagues have also found that multilingualism may offer protective effects for normal age-related memory loss. For example, in one study, Bialystock reported that memory loss is delayed by 4 years in multilinguals compared to monolinguals. And in another study, multilingualism was shown to offer protective effects for people with Alzheimer's disease. That is, even with comparable neurodegeneration, multilinguals showed fewer symptoms of the disease. Bialystock and others' research on cognitive control has opened the floodgates for all sorts of studies on potential positive effects of multilingualism on the mind. But before we explore a few of these different areas, I need to address a legitimate concern. Starting in the early 2010s, the entire scientific community has been rocked by what some call a replication crisis. This has hit psychology particularly hard because studies about human behavior and the human mind are among the most covered in the media. Given the splashy nature of the cognitive control and bilingualism research, many have tried to replicate these basic findings, but attempts have produced mixed results. There have been some replications, but in other studies, the cognitive control phenomenon has disappeared when different definitions of bilingualism are used and when certain confounding variables are controlled for, like subject education levels and lifestyle factors. Another limitation is sample size. Much of the original work on cognitive control and bilingualism used very small numbers. For example, in one early study by Bialystock, there were only 10 participants per condition. A recent trend in psychology and neuroscience is to use very large samples to ensure more statistically reliable findings. In one ambitious study, Anthony Dick and his team at Florida International University tested 4,500 participants across 21 sites around the United States, and they found no evidence for a cognitive advantage for bilinguals. In fact, they found, if anything, bilinguals were at a disadvantage in vocabulary size. Now, it's still early days for research on the cognitive control benefits of bilingualism, and time will tell which findings are robust and which are more fragile. Personally, I don't see this as a crisis, but rather as a perfectly healthy situation where the scientific method is doing its job of separating the wheat from the chaff. Despite this uncertainty surrounding cognitive control, there's been an absolute explosion of research investigating all the other possible byproducts of speaking more than one language. And with over half of the world's population being multilingual and so many monolinguals trying to learn a foreign language, the topic's just too relevant to ignore. Many of the exciting research questions I'll share with you weren't being asked prior to the new millennium. So most of these studies have only a short track record, meaning they don't have the luxury of collecting giant samples and having multiple replications. For this reason, we'll need to interpret much of this new work with caution. Here are the 3 topics that we'll consider: personality, decision-making, and social skills. I'll start with personality because it has its roots well before the neuroscience boom in the 1990s. The pioneering sociolinguist Susan Irving Tripp was one of the first researchers to empirically study how people change when they speak different languages. According to Irving Tripp, her dissertation at the University of Michigan in 1955 was inspired by her college best friend at Vassar, a budding poet named Jacqueline Frank. Frank was a French-English bilingual who used to say that she felt like 2 different people when speaking French and English. If you have friends or family who are multilingual, you should ask them if they also feel this. In my experience, it's quite common, and people seem to enjoy talking about it. Irving Tripp had French-English bilinguals perform a well-known psychological assessment called the Thematic Apperception Test, or TAT. The TAT involves pictures of ambiguous scenes, like a man pulling away from a woman's embrace with the woman looking directly at the man. These evocative pictures are designed to produce diverse stories about what is happening in the scene, what people in the scene are thinking and feeling, and what's going to happen next, just very evocative images. One group of bilinguals was shown a set of pictures and asked to tell a story about them in English. Then they were shown the same set again in a different order and asked to tell the stories about them in French. In a second group, the bilinguals did the same thing, but they started in French and then switched to English. The main findings were that when bilinguals were speaking French, they had more descriptions that mentioned verbal arguments. But when they were speaking English, they had more themes that included physical violence. Interestingly, when talking in English, people were also more likely to describe the women in the scenes as being supportive as wives, helping their husbands achieve their goals. Now, it's not clear that the people were actually changing their personalities or whether the languages just primed them